Yeah. Yes. I was actually, as I got ready, I was just listening to your podcast with Kirsty. I only got a few minutes in, but actually, it's actually started to record on Zoom. Oh, okay. I can see that. Stop recording. Yeah. I'll just, okay. I think I'll just pause it.
Recording.
There
we go.
Recording.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone watching the replay. Jess and I have just been discussing tech issues with Zoom to start with, but also what a wonderful influence, I guess, she's been on my life with my family, and how I've relied on her to help me, I guess, to support me through my own healing of my adrenal fatigue, as well as lots of random things that my family have gone through, and how much I love sort of being part of her. I access her membership, and I just learned so much in there. So I'm really excited to dive into these topics with Jess, because I know her head is just so full of this lots and lots of information that I just learned something from every time. And tonight we're talking about whether food intolerances are to blame for our kids' moodiness, their sleep issues, and obviously even their fussy eating as well. And so we've had some patient participants in the call already who have been waiting for us to sort out the tech issues, and now we're recording for the replay. So we're going to dive straight in, and Jess was just going to define the difference between a food intolerance versus a food allergy, because it's so important that we understand the difference right before we start diving into the details.
Yeah, definitely. So with a food allergy, it's really obvious. So the onset of a food allergy happens really quickly. So these are the sorts of, allergies that will lead to an anaphylactic reaction. And so what's happening in the body is what we call an IgE reaction. So our body is producing IgE antibodies. And so the onset is really quickly. So these are the sorts of kids that, will have a little bit of peanut, and they will, start to get symptoms almost immediately. So really quick onset, which makes it really easy to determine that there's a food allergy. You've literally eaten the food, and within minutes there are symptoms starting to happen. And a tiny amount of, it doesn't take a lot of volume of the food to cause this type of reaction. What we're more focusing on tonight is the IgG, reaction. So when the body is producing IgG antibodies, so it's just a different type of antibody, and this is known as more of a food intolerance. So the onset of this kind of reaction doesn't happen straight away. In fact, it can take up to about 72 hours for this type of reaction to occur. And so it makes it much harder to figure out what is going on. It's not just the meal that you've eaten just then. It may not even be, based on a food that you've eaten in the meal before. It can literally take days for this kind of reaction to occur.
And sorry to interrupt, but that is exactly why I think a lot of us feel a little bit overwhelmed and a bit like it's in the too hard basket a lot of the time, because it's just so seemingly very hard to identify. So it's going to be really great to talk with you tonight about how we can make some sense of that, and how we can sort of move our way through and actually identify. So
yes, exactly. And this is why there is so much confusion, because, keeping a food diary can get you only so far, but, you don't always know when that sort of reaction, when that food was consumed that is causing the reaction. These types of reactions are also more dose dependent. So a lot of kids will have a tolerance, like a certain tolerance level. So if they have a little bit of a food, they may not get a reaction, which makes it even more confusing. Yeah. But if they go over their particular tolerance level, then they will get reactions. So allergies we will know about. Intolerances we may not know about. And as you said, this is why there's so much confusion in this area.
It's hard enough to identify it even in ourselves. We're so in touch with how we feel. And when we're not in our children's bodies, we can't know what they're feeling day to day while they're at school or wherever they are. And so you can tell that this is a topic that has been on my mind for one of my children in particular for actually years. And it's I really need to get to the bottom of it. So I'll be listening with bated breath. So what are some of the symptoms of food intolerance? I mean, there's
Yes.
so many, I'm sure.
There is a lot. And this is, again, why it can be such a confusing area. So there's the typical gastrointestinal symptoms, maybe a tummy ache, maybe diarrhea or loose bowel movements, gas, reflux, sometimes even sort of constipation can result from food intolerances, like vomiting, heartburn. So there's all those gastrointestinal symptoms that most kids with food intolerances will have, some of or some degree of. But there's also a whole heap of other range of symptoms. Skin symptoms are really common. So rashes, hives, eczema can be linked to food intolerances really commonly. Mood, sleep, and behavioural issues. And I hear from lots of mums that have finally got answers when it comes to, they've finally figured out what their kids are intolerant to, that the mood and behavioural symptoms will come before the digestive symptoms often. So they'll notice that their kids are a bit irritable, a bit restless, a bit hyperactive, having tantrums and meltdowns. And of course, these kinds of these kinds of symptoms can be caused by a whole heap of different things. We don't automatically think when our kids are having a meltdown, oh, it's a food intolerance. Like, it's not really, really obvious. There's also things like headaches and joint pain, fatigue, picky eating, respiratory symptoms, so coughs, wheezing can also be common. So again, with this whole range of different symptoms, it can be really tricky to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess when we're talking about food intolerance, and tonight we're linking it in with picky eating. I know that there is an obvious connection there, but it also has a little bit of a disconnect, because our children don't always know we know that they don't always know what's good for them, right? They're constantly reaching for junk food or asking for it, and they're drawn to this stuff that's no good for them. But let's just talk a little bit about how we can make that connection between food intolerance and picky eating. How does that work?
Yeah, so I see this, a lot with kids with food intolerances. And I guess the obvious part of it is that if kids feel uncomfortable after eating a lot of the time because they do have intolerances, they may not even articulate, that they have a tummy ache or that they're feeling grumpy, in terms of a mood symptom. But if they, if they link food with, eating with not feeling good afterwards, then they can become really picky eaters. The other thing is that dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of good and bad bacteria within the gut, leads to like cravings and a need and a want for the more sugary, carbohydrate-rich, refined foods as well. So the dysbiosis, which is really common in kids, which is basically an imbalance of good and bad bacteria within the gut, an overgrowth of the pathogenic or bad bacteria, is linked to both fussy eating and is linked with food intolerances as well. I've got a little story I can share of a little girl. She was 2 at the time. This was a couple of years ago that she came and saw me. And she was a very picky eater. She had lots of tummy symptoms and like gut symptoms, lots of bowel issues. She was always getting sick. And her mum just said, she doesn't really enjoy being around her because she's always moody. She's always having meltdowns. And she was 2. So, this was the mum's first child. So is that just normal for this 2-year-old sort of behavior? But as we started to determine what some of her food intolerances were, for her it was fructose and dairy. When we removed those from her diet, within weeks she was a completely different child. Her mum didn't even recognize her in terms of her mood and her behavior. Her sleep improved. And so she was a really picky eater. And as those, the other symptoms started to reduce, she just started naturally accepting more and more variety in her diet, which was a huge stress off of, mum and dad as well.
So how did you decide then that it was fructose and dairy? What led you in that situation to go for those things?
Yeah, so I guess as a naturopath, we're always looking for little clues. We're like detectives, as mums are talking to us, we're going, oh, okay, so that So there's certain symptoms that are commonly linked to certain food intolerances, and really working with the qualified practitioner is my number one tip with this. Like when you're in it with your, you know, own children, it can really be hard to sort of sift through and figure out. But to give you a couple of examples with fructose intolerance, which is a really common in kids, and let's face it, I mean, you know, we encourage our kids to eat more fruit because it's a healthy snack. And sometimes, you know, particular fruits, high fructose fruits, can be, you know, causing a lot of the issues that our kids are having. So with fructose intolerance, you commonly see bloating, loose bowel movements or diarrhea, wind, and often iron deficiency as well, because the absorption of iron is affected when there's a fructose intolerance. With dairy, there's commonly, you know, the things that are little clues for me with dairy are a history of reflux, eczema, like frequent ear infections is a really common one. Congestion is a really common one. So, you know, those sorts of, and these things can be linked to other things. So it's not always the case that it is a particular food intolerance, but I guess as a naturopath, we're looking for those kind of hints and clues as to what might be going on.
Is there anything else that us parents can be doing before we go ahead and meet with someone like you or another qualified practitioner? Is there anything that we can be preparing, like a food diary or something, that would help that process along?
Yes, that's such a great question. And yeah, I think a food diary and a symptom diary are really helpful. When mums come to me with things like that, it is, you know, it becomes much easier to sort of figure out what is going on. So, you know, tracking and just jotting down what that child is eating in a day, and then, you know, you could even give their mood and behavior a score out of 10. So then you don't have to take really detailed notes, but, you know, are they a 10 out of 10 in their mood and behavior? Like, are they doing really well that day, or are they, you know, a 2 out of 10? Has there been lots of meltdowns and tantrums and irritability and that sort of thing? And then obviously tracking bowel habits can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, which is a bit tricky with the older kids who don't like to tell you very much.
I know, I'm at that stage, you know, I've looked at my kids' poos forever, and now they're 13 and 11. There is no way that is happening anymore. They won't even explain them to me anymore. So yeah, it does get trickier as they get older.
Yeah. And actually our 14-year-old has started to, you know, earn her own money, and she likes to go spend it at the canteen at school. And so sometimes you've actually got no idea what's going on, you know, unless they're very transparent and open with you.
Yes, I know. I'm in that stage with my son who's 13, and he's obsessed with his mountain bike, and he's out all day on the weekends with his friends, which is great in one way. But of course they take money to buy lunch, and, you know, it's not always the best choice, but you lose that control over what your kid, you know, that full control over what they're eating. So I just make sure he has a really good nutritious breakfast and a really good nutritious dinner, and hope he's exactly. Hope he's making okay choices while he's out.
So before we leave the food diary too much, I had a question for you about the template. I mean, you've said just jot down what they've had and, you know, score their behavior and any other symptoms out of 10. And that makes it sound so simplistic, because when I've tried to do it in the past, I've tried to, Jess knows me, I like a bit of like an Excel spreadsheet. And so I have, I've always just tried to like maybe overkill, and it's just become too much of a project, and I've never followed through with it properly. And so really it is that simple. Just, I mean, because you might make a dinner with 15 different ingredients in it. So you literally just have to just throw it all down on the piece of paper. And then I've tried, yeah, okay, I think I'm unique. As I went to say this out loud, I realized how unique this probably is. I was trying to make Excel spreadsheets that then automatically tried to detect patterns and things, because you could make a food diary, but then not be able to, like you've said, sometimes there's such a delay in symptoms that I guess that's where the qualified practitioner comes in.
Exactly. So yes, and that's, yeah. So as a parent, if you can have something to go into a practitioner with, that is, that's a really good head start from having nothing. But yeah, I think you've really I guess hit the nail on the head in terms of if it's too complex and too hard, as busy parents, we're just not going to be able to maintain it. So you've got to think about what you'll be able to maintain for a good couple of weeks, if not longer. Yeah, and the Excel spreadsheet definitely does not sound sustainable.
Yeah, it's me to a T. So Jess, I know that you've got 4 go-to areas to address if you suspect food intolerance in your child. So can you let us know what those 4 areas are?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about food intolerances, really the crux of it is that the gut is not producing enough of the right stuff to be able to break food down. So, going back to that difference between allergy and intolerance and IgG and IgG, they're immune mediated responses. To make it even a bit more complex and complicated, there's also food intolerances that are linked commonly with a lack of enzymes. And lactose intolerance is a great example of that. It's a really common intolerance, and it's where the body hasn't got the ability to produce enough lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. So what we need to do is we really need to optimize gut function first and foremost. We need to make sure all of the excretions that should be happening in the gut are happening as well as they should. So that includes stomach acid and enzyme production are the 2 main ones. And so there's lots of different sort of tools that we have as naturopaths to be able to help that. And that's individual depending on what's going on for each child. But the mineral zinc is really important for both proper hydrochloric acid production in the stomach and proper enzyme production throughout the digestive tract. So zinc is a nutrient that is needed by kids for lots of different reasons. But if you do think that your child's kind of enzyme and hydrochloric acid production might be down, if they do have intolerances, then upping their zinc content either in their diet or in supplement form would be a really great place to start. So optimizing gut function overall is really important.
I've heard you reference zinc so many times. Zinc is that superstar mineral, isn't it?
It really is. For kids particularly, so important for the gut, so important for the immune system, so important for neurological function, for growth, development, healing. Zinc is so important for kids, and a lot of kids are not getting enough zinc, particularly if they're not eating red meat, because red meat is a good source of zinc. So anyone who has, is vegetarian or their kids are picky with red meat should definitely think about a zinc supplement for sure. And then, so the second point that is really important for food intolerances is the microbiome. And I talk about the microbiome a lot as well. So whenever there is a lack of diversity within the microbiome, food intolerances are much more common and food sensitivities are much more common. So we want to look after our kids' microbiome. There's lots of different ways that we can do that. Fermented foods, probiotic supplements, encouraging our kids to play outside more, because that just being outside helps to
sunshine.
So it's such an easy one and such an enjoyable one. Not always easy to get the kids outside, but something we can do as a family more to improve all of our gut is to spend more time outside. So looking after the microbiome is the second thing that I'm thinking about. The third thing is the integrity of the gut lining. So when there are food intolerances, there is often also leaky gut. And so this is a term you may have heard of or you may have read about. Basically, the gut should be a nice tight tube where food stays in until it's fully broken down and then it absorbs into the bloodstream. When there's leaky gut, it means that proteins from the food that we've eaten are leaking into the bloodstream before they've been fully broken down. And that is not what we want, because then the immune system elicits a response, and that's when we end up with food intolerances and food sensitivities. It's actually a really big cause of food sensitivities and intolerances. So we need to look after the lining of the gut, and things like, too much sugar in the diet, frequent antibiotic use, lots of antibacterial chemicals and things like that can play havoc with that gut lining. So we really want to be looking after that. And the fourth is the immune regulation. So we want to make sure that the immune system is nice and well balanced. And by working on 1, 2, and 3, we're helping with that immune regulation, because good gut health really equals kind of better immune regulation. But also vitamin D is really important in immune regulation. And so again, you know, that being outside, getting exposure to the sun is really important. So you can see, again, it is fairly complex and there are a lot of things to be thinking about. So, you know, but a lot of them tie in together. You know, as we start to improve the microbiome, the enzyme production within the gut will improve. And as we start to improve enzyme production, other areas of the gut will improve as well. So it's, you know, it's not like they're all separate things that we need to work on. We can just choose one. And my top pick would be that microbiome diversity, and start working there first. And like I've said, you know, always seek expert support to sort of get these things under control.
It's fascinating how much of our health is dictated by our gut. And I'm sure that it's no surprise to most people if they've, you know, been in the health world for an amount of time. It's just so prevalent that the amount of studies that we have now that prove that the gut is just a huge player in our health is just irrefutable. So it's but that being said, I feel like a lot of us are still floundering learning how to care for that gut, because it is a big lifestyle change to go from, I guess, the common Western diet and way of living, especially in this modern day and age of, you know, like you said, not as much outdoor time with so many screens and things, to quite a well-nurtured gut. And so that journey can take some time, of course. And it's something that I know that you teach about a lot. Can we open up for questions, Jess? Have you got time?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm happy to answer questions for sure.
Before we do that, can you just give us a quick little summary of those 4 areas?
Yeah.
And then as Jess is doing that, guys, if you have questions, just pop them in the box there and we'll be able to get to them.
Sure. So yeah, those 4 areas were that overall gut function. So improving, you know, the stomach acid production and the enzyme production. And zinc is a really good way to do that. Improving the health of the microbiome, which, as well as being really beneficial for the food intolerances and sensitivities, has so many other beneficial effects on our kids' well-being. So that should be a priority for all parents. And it doesn't mean that we need to be, you know, in the kitchen fermenting all day, every day. There's definitely, you know, lots of shortcuts that we can take to improve the microbiome. And I'm happy to kind of share the details of the masterclass, which I've got coming up, where we'll go into a bit more detail specifically on that microbiome piece. And the third one was the integrity of the gut wall. So that one's really important as well. And it's food intolerances are commonly linked to leaky gut. And then that immune regulation is really important, because when there's allergies or intolerances, it's a sign that our kids' immune system is a bit overactive. So it's reacting to things within our diet or sometimes our environment that it shouldn't be. So we need to kind of bring that immune system back into a more regulated state.
Thank you. It's like you said, it can sound a little bit overwhelming when you list it all out, but something that Jess said before, I know that a couple of people have just joined us, and something that Jess said before is that you can just pick one area which will undoubtedly have a domino effect on the others, and so it doesn't have to be a huge overwhelming thing. Jess, I actually have a question about one of my daughters. I've got 4 of them, and one of them has, I know it's summer, and so this question you may think it's probably just from the temperature, because we're up here in Queensland where it does get quite hot, but she has sort of at dinner time, all she wants is something fresh. Like, she will quite happily munch down on a fresh salad or heaps of fruit. Like she would just, all she wants is fruit and veg and uncooked. So she won't, like if I make, I don't know, a casserole, or even not even that. What did we have the other night? I made homemade fish and chips. And the night before that, I made nachos. And it was too, here she is. I'm talking about you, Sophia. And so it was too hot for her. It was cooked. She didn't want cooked. She just wants fresh. So would you, I mean, what's your initial reaction to that? Is there anything there that causes alarm bells, or is it simply just a temperature issue that's just a preference?
Well, it could, like, the other thing, so yes, it could certainly be, you know, the temperature thing. Is she good at drinking water? Because she may be sort of dehydrated. So looking for those more hydrating foods, that could be part of the issue. It also can be like a constitutional issue, like she's just made up that way, and you know, she kind of prefers those kinds of you know, fresh crunchy foods over you know, cooked foods. But I guess what the alarm bells or the concerns would be, you know, is she getting enough protein? Is she getting enough of those nutrients that are contained in you know, the more protein-based foods, which it sounds like she doesn't have a preference for. So I'd be thinking about things like zinc and iron and B12, and whether she may potentially be lacking those things. Yeah, so my daughter, who's 11, is a bit similar. Like she's always looking for fresh food, which, I mean, a lot of parents listening are probably like, oh, well, I wish my kids would crave fresh food. You know, if we went to Bali a couple of years ago and she was dying to get home just to have some cucumber sticks.
The daughter of a naturopath, love it.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's sort of related to any sort of intolerance or anything, but it does kind of bring up those questions about, is she getting enough of those nutrients that I mentioned? Yeah.
And she has sort of been complaining of low energy as well, so I'm sure that's connected.
Yeah, potentially with that, the iron and the B12. Maybe she needs a blood test. Maybe the idea of a blood test might get her eating some different.
She's very brave, this one. So I think unlike another of my daughters. But Ada has said that she's here to learn more for her granddaughter, as we think that she may be dairy intolerant. And my daughter follows Jess on Facebook, and she can't be here tonight to tune into the masterclass. Oh, that's nice of you, Ada, to do that for your daughter and your granddaughter.
Aww.
So you mentioned that the familiar symptoms of a dairy intolerance are commonly skin issues, right? And congestion in the nose. So things to look out for would be eczema, and would dermatitis be in that ballpark as well? Yeah,
definitely. Congestion, frequent ear infections are really common with dairy intolerance, and tummy issues are really common as well. So there can be like constipation, but there can also be tummy aches and sort of irregular bowel movement. So no sort of, you know, pattern, and going from constipation to looser sort of bowel movements. And a history of reflux is usually a big kind of red flag that there's potentially a dairy intolerance too. Dairy intolerance is the most common intolerance in kids, and so and one thing that we sort of didn't talk about, we talked about how tricky it is to determine whether there's these sorts of food intolerances going on. One of the best ways to figure them out is to do a elimination and reintroduction challenge. So I can give you a bit of an example for dairy. I would recommend, you know, just going off dairy or taking dairy out of her diet for 6 weeks at least. One of the big mistakes people make is doing it for a couple of weeks and saying, it didn't make any difference. It needs to be at least 6 weeks. And when I say just take her off dairy for 6 weeks, I know that is not easy for a lot of kids. But it really is the best way for us to determine whether there is an intolerance. And an intolerance isn't necessarily forever. And this is why we talk about, you know, working on those 4 areas, because that is where we're going to get an improvement in allergic tolerance. So improving that tolerance level, as opposed to just taking the dairy out and thinking, okay, she can't have dairy forever anymore. If we're working on those 4 areas we talked about, over time, she'll be able to start tolerating, more and more dairy. And as I said, there's that tolerance level. So she may be able to have a little bit of butter, but she might not be able to have a glass of milk, as an example. And just one other point on that as well, if taking dairy out of the diet just seems too huge and unmanageable, then you can look at just taking the A1 protein dairy out. And Lainey, I'm sure you've heard me talk about this before. I've got a blog over at Natural Super Kids sort of outlining this. If you just type dairy into the search bar, you'll find it. But if a lot of the time it's the A1 protein in dairy that's more problematic. So you could have goats milk products, sheep's milk products, and A2 based products, which are fairly common in the supermarkets these days, or even pure Jersey cow dairy products are A2 only as well. So that kind of opens up another can of worms, but I did just want to mention that if taking dairy out of the diet is, feels like a big deal, which it does for most of us.
Yeah, that's actually a really empowering piece of information because, like you said, kids and dairy, my goodness, it's hard to separate them. So being able to eliminate and test that way is huge.
Yeah.
I have a bit of a curly question for you, Jess, before we sort of tie up and tell everyone about your amazing masterclass coming up. But I had a question, which again is from our lovely daughter that was standing right here. Yeah. I remember meeting with you about some of her symptoms. This was years ago. And you advised me to do an elimination test with her by removing gluten and dairy and seeing what happens. And try as I might, I just couldn't get her to agree to it. And she's suffered with sinus and with low energy for a long time, but I cannot find something to motivate her enough to separate from those two food groups for her. We don't have a lot of gluten in this house. We have a lot of spelt, which, is not gluten-free, but, she barely has much gluten, but I know it doesn't take a lot of gluten to have an effect for these kids. And so what do you tell parents when they are not able to get their kids to agree? Because there is a fine line. My husband and I had a discussion about the ethics, I guess, of parenting and whether we force our children to do something that we know may be best for them, as opposed to letting them make their own choices and dealing with their own consequences. So I'm guessing that you come across that fairly frequently in your work. So what do you tell parents?
Yeah, such a good question. And I agree, I think sometimes kids have to make those decisions for themselves, particularly older kids. If we've got 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, it's much easier for us to just say, okay, we're just not, that's not coming in the house or whatever. But with older kids, like we were talking about before, they've got independence. We don't have complete control over what they're eating when they're out and about and that sort of thing. So the first thing I would say is you can, try one thing at a time. And as I said, it doesn't have to be all of dairy. So you could start with just removing the A1 dairy protein and see what happens. That's a much easier project than removing all of dairy and all gluten. Same with gluten, like you could just remove wheat from the diet, which it sounds like you guys probably don't have wheat. I mean, you've got spelt. So as you said, that's got gluten in it, but it's not a wheat sort of based gluten. Well, it is a wheat. We can get quite complex. It is an ancient wheat, but you could start with just removing sort of processed wheat and more of the refined wheat products and see if that makes a difference. The only problem with that sort of approach is it generally takes you a lot longer to get answers. So even though it's an easier project or an easier kind of feat, it does take longer. So that motivation needs to be there to continue. I guess, it's empowering your kids and which, I'm sure you do in terms of letting them know what these particular foods may be causing, and then really they have to make that decision whether that pain point is severe enough for them to, you know, to remove these things from their diet. It's really tricky, and it is really individual in terms of how each family does kind of tackle it. And some families will just kind of, you know, be strict and say, right, we're not doing this, or we're not having it in the house. But like I said, with older kids, they can buy things at the canteen, or they can, you know, have things when they're out and about with their friends. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it, like you said, when they're younger, I think it's easy just to take control. But yeah, when they get older, it is a bit of give and take and figuring it out as you go.
Yeah, and it depends on the severity of their symptoms as well, I guess, and how much that's impacting their well-being and the family's well-being as well. You know, if their mood is greatly affected and it's affecting everyone around them, and you can see that, you know, their quality of life really isn't as good as it could be, then, you know, maybe you want to take a bit of a stricter stance. But if it's, you know, just a bit of congestion, even though she would probably benefit from removing those foods, you know, like I said, that pain point probably isn't high enough for her to kind of take that leap.
And I think that's what it's about, isn't it? When it gets when it gets big enough in your life, you actually do something about it. So it's disappointing that it often gets that way for us adults, but also for our kids. But Jess, there's so many things that you've given us to go on tonight. And I know that, you know, time's ticking on, particularly down south. So I wanted to thank you for being here. I know you've got a wonderful masterclass coming up. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So the masterclass is next week, and I'm running 2 different times. So the subject, it's all about gut health, of course, and I'm going to be sharing 3, I'm calling them surprisingly simple ways to transform your kids' gut health to improve their behavior, immunity, allergies, and fussy eating. So it's going to be full of practical strategies. We're going to be talking a lot about the microbiome, and we touched on those 4 areas that are really important to be addressing when it comes to food intolerances. So we'll definitely be covering, you know, those areas and how we can improve our kids' gut health overall, and delving into some more information about how our kids and even our gut health as adults affects our immunity, our mood, our behavior, our eating tendencies. So just really opening up people's eyes to why gut health is so important, but most importantly, giving people, you know, practical strategies. And so we've got the masterclasses happening next week, but we've got a pop-up Facebook group, which we've just opened today. So we've got bonus trainings happening in there and prizes. One from the Whole Food Collective, competitions, support from me and my team in there as well. So we try and make it as fun as possible.
Sounds great. I don't think I've joined that Facebook group yet, so I'll have to get the link from you. And do you get it once you join the masterclass? Do you get a link to the Facebook group?
Yes, it's a little secret link. So so you just need to sign up for the masterclass, and then you can, then you'll get invited to the Facebook group. I think that was I think that, have you just seen that? It's the wrong link.
Yeah, do you have the right link there, Jess, or should I look it up?
No, I don't have it handy.
That is all right. I think I have just got it here. Here it is. I've got it. All right, this is the link to the masterclass. If you will click that other link, you will also get a free ebook about gut health from Jess.
Yes.
But that second link there is for the masterclass, and I'll send it around to you guys tomorrow as well. But I will be there at the masterclass. It's always great to pick up more tips, and it sounds like these ones are actually achievable to put into your life. So that's always good.
Yeah, I try and make things as practical and achievable as possible, because as we've heard tonight, like, gut health can be quite complex, and there's lots of different things that we can do. But in my years of naturopathic practice, you know, I've figured out there's these kind of, you know, main areas that get us the best results. So that's what I'm going to be sharing on the masterclass.
Well, I look forward to it. Thank you so much for being here, Jess. I know that we've all gotten a lot out of it for our own children, and figuring out what is going on for them sometimes. And, you know, I bet a lot of people here tonight are actually here from a preventative and education type point of view, because we haven't had particular questions come through about their own kids' food intolerances or sensitivities. And so it's really wonderful that so many parents are actually coming at this from a preventative and education point of view. So that's just so great, guys. Thank you for being here.
I agree. I think it's really important, no matter what the state of your kids' health is, that we just have these kind of, habits that we are constantly kind of, working towards, like the outdoor play and getting more fermented foods into our kids. This sort of stuff, if we can keep on with that as more of a preventative approach, then that's only going to be good for our kids' overall well-being.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jess, for being here. Thank you, everyone else, for being here. I hope you have a wonderful sleep tonight. And I look forward to the masterclass, and I'm going to join that group to get those free trainings as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone who watched and joined.
Bye, guys. Have a good night.
Yeah.